Hello and welcome to another edition of The Front Page on GNAT TV. My name's Andrew McKeever and I'll be your host today. I'm the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and today it's my pleasure to have with us here in the studio down here in Sunderland an old friend of mine. I've actually known him since before he became famous as a bookseller at the Northshire Bookstore, Mr. Bill Lewis. Bill, welcome to GNAT.
Thanks, Andrew.
Great to have you here. Bill has been with the Northshire on and off as a part-time, full-time employee for the past 25 years and is known as one of their foremost experts and booksellers, and an expert particularly in the area of their history books. And I know that whenever I'm wandering into the bookstore to go make a purchase, the first person I would want to look up if I'm buying a history book is Bill, because he always seems to guide me in the right direction, and towards one of the larger books too, I might add, that sort of, keep me going for quite a while. But anyway, Bill, I'm sure a lot of our viewers probably remember history class back in high school or college as being one of those courses they had to take that, featured a lot of big books and occasionally a lot of dry reading about dead kings and presidents and other phenomena from centuries past that made them wonder, well, what does this have to do with me? How does this affect my life today? But as you and I both know, there's an awful lot of consequences that have flowed from past events and even recent past events. But the question I guess I wanted to pose first is, there's an awful lot of books on histories of one sort or another, whether it's American history, European history, or histories from all countries. What is the difference, in your opinion, as someone who has read widely throughout this entire genre, between really excellent history writing and some of the more, shall we say, pedestrian variety that we all remember from reading back in high school or whenever, when, you kind of felt, wow, this is kind of a little on the clunky side.
Yeah, big question.
What are the elements that go into making a history book really interesting?
Well, I speak primarily from my own point of view, Andrew. I have no patience with writing that isn't clear. It doesn't have to be lyrical or luminous, but it's got to be clear. The factual content of the book has to be solid. The first thing I do when I pick up a history book to decide whether it's something I'm interested in reading is to go to the bibliography and the footnotes. I'm always interested in knowing what the writer has consulted. Books that I've read earlier, primary sources. And then, in addition to accuracy, factual content, and clean declarative writing, I want to be able to follow the perspective, the argument, the theory of the writer, and feel reassured that he or she is backing up their points of view with good information. I think those are the three key things, and it can come from professional academics who toil away in universities and institutes, and thank goodness, here in the early 20th century, we're in a time period now where there's great respect for popular historians. People who used to be, if not sneered at, looked at by the academic establishment as if they simply were looking to make money by writing interesting books. The standards that apply for popular history writing, as well as academic history writing, are universally very high on both sides. And I guess that's the short answer to your question.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there's a much longer one we could have. That's interesting. I mean, that sounds very similar in a lot of ways to newspaper writing, where the sources are basically what it's all about.
And it's interesting, some of the excellent popular histories, not written by professors, are by people who have a journalism background. Because as you know, clarity, brevity, using a two-syllable word instead of a four-syllable word, one sentence instead of an entire paragraph. A lot of the good history writing today from the popular side of things comes from journalism.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, trying to break it down so that it's comprehensible to the average reader without sacrificing the content and the sophistication of what you're talking about. It's not an easy game or an easy balance to strike. But so, what are some of the books that have been published recently, or ones that you have found particularly interesting and kind of noteworthy in one respect or another, that combine like an exciting or interesting narrative with good, clear writing that's backed up by solid sources?
Well, there are literally dozens. I look at over 100 history books a year. I probably start reading about 75 history books, biographies each year. I probably finish a little over 50. It's an impossible task at the end of the year to choose 2 or 3 or a half dozen as the best. But this particular book, which is volume 4 in Robert Caro's wonderful multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson, is a fine example of a writer who has immersed himself in his subject and is meticulous in citing all the sources for every word he writes. I don't know how long the bibliography is, but as is typical with a lot of good history and biography, it's not uncommon to have 100 pages after you've finished reading the text of bibliography and footnotes. Caro is so intense in his research. I mean, this is a 30-year process that he's been engaged in, that one can't help but be impressed with the reliability, the trustworthy quality of what he's telling the reader. He's also a clean, dramatic writer. This book, which only covers 5 years of Johnson's life, puts the reader into the scenes. I'll give you an example. The day that Lyndon Johnson has on Friday, November 22, 1963, is covered from the time he leaves his hotel until the time he gets back to Washington late at night. And at all points along the timeline, you feel as if you are in the room, in the car, in the motorcade, in the hospital, on the plane waiting for the president's widow and the president's coffin to be brought back to the plane.
This is, of course, November 22nd, 1963 is the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
You can feel the temperature. You can feel the sounds. You know, when you read Robert Caro, what it must have been like. That's a gift, but it's a gift that we get because Caro's put in the hard work.
Let me ask a question. What is the trade-off between access to archives and a president? How does that? There must be a certain tricky, again, sort of fine line that a lot of historians and biographers in particular have to walk between getting access to a subject, and perhaps in Caro's case it's a little different with Johnson, and being objective about their subject. I mean, do biographers also often have to think about, well, gee, if I'm going to write something that maybe is not quite as flattering about this guy as he might want to read, am I going to not be able to see some documents or not be able to interview the person as extensively as you might want to?
Well, I think the key word in starting to answer that would be one-syllable word: time. There is a very good reason why historians will always remind us that we get the best information when a period of time has passed after the subject has either passed away or has left the scene. Passion's cool. People have time to remember. People become more accessible. Archives open up that were sealed. I'll give you a perfect example. There is a new book just published 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's called The Patriarch. It's written by David S. Nassau, and it's a biography of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. Nassau's calling card from his earlier work is scrupulous balance and fairness, and an inexhaustible amount of research. He was approached by the late Senator Ted Kennedy and Senator Kennedy's sister, Jean Smith, and asked to write a biography of old Joe. Nassau said, "I'd be interested in doing it, but I want unfettered access to everything. I want complete control over what I write. And secondly, I can't do this biography until foreign sources are available." And that meant everything from going to Israel to find information that people have known has existed, but it was never available, going to the Vatican in Rome and getting into files that had been sealed for 60 and 70 years, and going to Great Britain.
Where Kennedy Sr. had been an ambassador.
Where he'd been an ambassador, and where the British kept extensive files about his activities, but those files were only recently becoming available with the British Secret Acts expiring.
70 plus years later.
70 plus years later. Now, most of what we know about old Joe Kennedy involves a few basic facts that everyone seems to accept: that he was a notorious womanizer, that he was a shady business operator, that he was a bootlegger, and that he was a failure politically.
Right.
All true to some extent or another, or possibly not true, as Nassau shows us. But Nassau said, enough time has passed so that I can go to the sources and not be interfered with by Kennedy's contemporaries who have their own axes to grind.
Sure. Or reputation.
So I think the answer is time. Now, all historians and biographers have to acknowledge when they start working that their own judgments, their own opinions, points of view are there. The best historians and biographers will continually remind the reader that this is my opinion, and here are the reasons why I hold that opinion. Mm-hmm. And that's perfectly okay. Bad biography, bad history frequently involves an author who is too anxious and too overbearing in trying to slant the story. The best historians and biographers let the facts speak for themselves. And I have no patience whatsoever for people who become too full of their own opinions. And those are the 20 or so books per year, in many cases, that I start and put down and don't finish.
After after the first 50 or 100 pages whether it's going to work or not. So has history writing changed, the style of history writing or the quality of it much in, let's say, the last 20 or 30 or so years? Has it evolved in any way, or is it still basically the same kind of thing someone might have?
Well, you and I are from the same generation, and you started by mentioning the kind of history courses we took. No question that in the 1960s, if you were a high school student, it was about memorizing names, dates, geographic locations. When I got to college, it seemed that every history book I was reading had graphs and bar charts and all kinds of what was known as the social history.
Right.
And that was important. It was important to learn about people who had not been at the front and center of American history writing earlier. To learn that it was not just about famous people like George Washington, but it was also about George Washington's slaves. It was about the poor, ordinary farmers who lived in Washington's era.
Because they made history just as much as he did.
As a matter of fact, for every leader like a Washington, there must be followers. And in many ways, what we started to see in the 60s into the 70s was the telling of their stories. The stories of Native American people, of African Americans, of women, people who were on the margins of history writing when you and I were mere lads. We have reached a point now where I think there's a far better balance. No serious writer of history or biography is unaware that those people are anything less than central to the story of how the past unfolds. And I really think that at the beginning of the 21st century, we're in a golden age of the best kind of nonfiction writing. I think that there's a very healthy balance today between focusing on well-known events and well-known individuals. I use George Washington over and over as an example, but I think history writing has changed for the better. There are no subjects that are taboo any longer. There is a recent book about Thomas Jefferson and slavery called Master of the Mountain, written by Henry Winsick. Most of the information that Winsick puts between the covers is information that's been coming out for a long time. The value of his book is that it summarizes in one modest-sized book the relationship between Jefferson, his slaves, and the greater question of slavery and racism during Jefferson's long lifetime. 30 years ago at Monticello and at the University of Virginia and other places where there was an immense amount of interest in Thomas Jefferson, there was not anywhere near the degree of openness that there is today. Today, the Monticello researchers and archivists, the UVA academics, and everyone else are not only comfortable with telling this story, but they're anxious to learn more about it. And so we get better history because it's more complete.
That's an interesting point you make, that we're in some kind of golden age right now of good history writing, that balance between the old sort of great figures of history being the 95% of the story, and then on the whole social history, groups of folks that in the past would have been, as you say, on the margins are almost completely ignored, whereas now we've seen sort of a synthesis, at least in the best history writing, where both sides of that are kind of coming into play. I guess I just wondered, is there anything you can think of that has prompted that? I mean, why in the last, I'm using the last 20 or 30 years as a yardstick, what has prompted that? Is that just simply better access to more information? Or
a lot of it is that's a lot of people in the post-World War II era, an era when more people went to college than at any time in our history. The GI Bill put tens of thousands of people into universities and colleges. It created a market for more complete history. The children of that post-World War II young adult generation, and those children represent our generation, were present when the country went through incredible changes in the 1960s. The modern civil rights movement, the women's equality movement, the Native American rights movement, all came to the forefront when you and I were teenagers. And it opened up areas of scholarship that never had existed in an acknowledged and formal way. I grew up in a town where there were almost no minority populations. And yet, somehow, when I was a sophomore or junior, someone decided that we should study black history. No one even knew what books to assign us. We read Frederick Douglass, and we read about the Underground Railroad, but it was a start. And people who experienced that began researching, asking questions, and ultimately teaching and writing books. The other thing that makes this time, early 21st century, so remarkable is that never have more people had more access more quickly to more information than right now.
Via the internet, obviously.
It was a surprise to me 10 or 12 years ago when, and I think it was Walter Isaacson's splendid biography of Benjamin Franklin, to see in his footnotes websites. Well, it's become common for historians to tell the reader that you can go to a free website at 3 o'clock in the morning wearing your bathrobe and not only read every letter that survives between Abigail and John Adams, but you can actually look at the documents. That was unimaginable when you and I were young. It was only in the late 1950s that all of the, speaking of letters, all of the surviving letters between Jefferson and Adams were made available to the public. It was only in the late 1950s that ongoing projects to catalog and present every document connected with Thomas Jefferson, not just his own letters, diaries, etc., but the letters he received. Those papers projects, the Jefferson project now is, I think 45 or 50 volumes. The Washington papers approaching 60 volumes. No one knows when the Adams papers will be finished. A big thrill for me a couple of weeks ago was meeting a woman in the bookstore whose job in New Haven, Connecticut is every day to work with the Benjamin Franklin papers. And this stuff is becoming more available.
You know, one of the things that I think is interesting about living here in our part of Vermont is that we have the great good fortune of getting a number of really excellent historians who come and do personal visits, not only at the Northshire Bookstore. We recently had Walter Starr, who has written a very highly acclaimed biography of William Seward, who was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, often known as the man who bought Alaska, Seward's Folly, but doesn't seem like such a folly now. And we also recently had David Hackett Fisher as part of the First Wednesdays program, who wrote Champlain's Dream, and as well as several other books. How is it difficult to get historians to come and do book tours and get them to come and to do presentations and book signings and things like that?
10 years ago, it was very difficult. Manchester is not situated halfway between Washington, D.C. and New York City. It takes a bit of effort to get here. But at this point, it's not as difficult as it was. We have worked very hard at the bookstore to build relationships through the publishers. with authors directly. I have been known to call an author at home and invite them to the bookstore. I did that with Mary Beth Norton, a Pulitzer finalist historian, several years back, and she came. She said, "I'd love to." David Hackett Fisher, you mentioned, there are fascinating stories about his relationship to this area, and specifically the Northshire Bookstore. When Washington's Crossing was a white-hot bestseller, I contacted Oxford Publishing in New York directly. I picked up the telephone. They informed me that Professor Fisher did not go to trade bookstores, and they apologized. Well, we kept selling the book. And a few months later, the same woman called me back from New York City, and she said, "David Fisher owes you one. What day should he be there? What time? And what would you like him to talk about?" Well, now Fisher has made 2 more visits to the area. Joseph Ellis was another Pulitzer-winning historian that we were able to get finally to come to the bookstore 8 or 9 years ago, and he's come back several times. Once the word gets out, things get easier. And now we're at a point where, even though we're still a bit difficult to get to geographically, and a California historian may only be on the East Coast promoting his or her book for a week or so, we're far more successful. And it's a combination of people at the bookstore other than myself. Mary Allen, our events coordinator, is splendid at staying in touch with publishers and reaching out to get high quality authors to appear. She works with the staff. She'll ask one of us to read a book and give our opinion. And then if we are pleased, she may very well succeed in getting that author. But it's far easier than it was 10 years ago.
Okay. Well, Bill, we're almost out of time, but of course I have to ask you one final question. The definitive history of the Uconn basketball team. This is serious, folks. Bill needs to talk about this. What is it, and how do we get a hold of it?
It's called Shock the World. I'm embarrassed to say it's just published 2 weeks ago, and I can't remember the author's name, but it's a history of Uconn basketball over the last 25 years, when the University of Connecticut Huskies went from being a regional powerhouse to being a national phenomenon.
Okay.
Thank you so much for asking me that, Andrew.
As you may have guessed, Bill is a bit of a passionate Uconn basketball fan.
Yes.
So anyway, now you see why when I wander into the Northshire Bookstore, I sort of wander around and get over to where Bill is at, because clearly he's a fount of great knowledge about not only great histories but also great books in general, and there's an awful lot of other folks there as well that can guide you in the right direction. But Bill, I want to thank you for making the time available to come and be on the show with us today, and to tell us a little bit about what some folks might want to put on their Christmas shopping lists if history runs in the family. And thank all of you for watching. This has been the front page on GNAT TV. My name's Andrew McKeever. Pleasure to have you with us today, and we'll see you again the next time around. Have a great day.